Okay, I think, hello, can you hear me? I think we can start. Well, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone here. My name is Neslihan Shanocak, and I'm an associate professor at the Department of History at Columbia, specializing in medieval Europe. And I currently serve as the director of the Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies, which sponsored this event along with a number of other centers and departments at Columbia. And today we have a wonderful panel of distinguished scholars who will expand our knowledge on the history of the city of Algiers. The focus of much of the modern studies on Algeria has been thus far on the colonial period after the invasion of France in 1830. So the aim of this panel is to recenter the historical debate on the Ottoman Algeria and explore the nature and continuity of its Ottoman legacy. I would like to thank very much to Zeynep Çelik, Emmanuelle Saada, Youssef, Ismail, and Anurag for organizing this panel. I will now briefly introduce the speakers, very briefly, of this panel. Professor Zeynep Çelik is the visiting Sakıp Sabancı professor at Columbia. We're very lucky to have her. And she works on French colonialism and late Ottoman Empire. Isabelle Grangaud is a director of research at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in Marseille, and she works on Algeria during the Ottoman period. And Emmanuelle Saada is my colleague at the Department of History, and she's also jointly appointed in the Department of French, and she works on French imperialism. Welcome again. Thank you.
Thank you, Neslihan, and welcome everybody. As Neslihan explained to you, one of the main goals of our panel is to question the year 1830 as the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. There has been a repeated oversight for many scholars of French colonialism in Algeria, myself included. And this has been a problem. There's before 1830 and there's after 1830. We know very well that periodization is arbitrary and it's often misleading, but clean-cut dates facilitate the construction of our narratives. I'm excusing our mistakes here, I guess. Periodization also takes away from the messiness of the stories we try to open up, and somehow messiness is difficult to deal with. So my presentation today attempts to look first at the city of Algiers, then move broader to Algeria around that infamous year, along the way revising my own arguments and highlighting several archives which hold relevant documents. This is very much a work in progress, a rehearsal of my early thoughts on the topic. My paper is rough and fragmented. I apologize for that, and I look forward to your feedback. I will deal with two main sets of sources. One, urban scale projects by the engineers of the French army from the 1830s. These are in the archives of the Service Historique de la Défense Château de Vincennes. And two, Ottoman documents from the Prime Minister's archives in Istanbul in the aftermath of the occupation. Let me begin with a painting that dates from the 1930s. Corresponding, of course, to the centennial of the French occupation. It is by Mohammed Racine, celebrated by the French for his authentic style and his faithful depictions of the colony and its inhabitants, both highly problematic. The miniature tradition did not exist in North Africa, hence his style is borrowed, and his topics are imagined. Racine is a complex artist, and a great deal has been written about him. Art historians pulling him in many different directions. I'll not get into any of that. We used Racine's painting in our poster because it is beautiful and because it tells the story of an Algiers that is devoid of colonial interventions. Among the praise of the centennial ceremonies, Racine focused on the famous rooftops and women peacefully occupying them. He erased the marks of French presence, which were very much there. And these include, for example, many colonial structures, especially on the waterfront. And there's not a hint of the major square opened here as early as 1830. The Ottoman court is in fact intact, so are the fortifications. You can see them, let me see. The fortifications are there, and this is not the French court, it's another court that is depicted here. I also would like to highlight the this mosque here, Mosque El Jadid, because I'm going to come back to it very soon. Recycling the cherished view of the city from the hills to the Mediterranean, the artist constructed an idealized moment in history, which would be reversed 30 years later by the realities of the decolonization war. A series of French projects to redesign the waterfront, the area around the Al Jadid Mosque, which is right here, allows us to return to the pre-colonial urban fabric Racine had imagined. The first documents, the opening of a place d'armes right in front of the Al Jadid Mosque, that white pole there. And this is where the central markets of the city were situated. Carved in haste, this shapeless but large space urgently accommodated military maneuvers. The drawing shows the urban structure in detail, the division of the lower and upper cities by a main artery, here going from one gate to the other on the walls, the street pattern, the location of the monuments, and the properties appropriated from the Ottomans who, following the occupation, fled to Istanbul and other places in the empire, Izmir and Crete among them. These properties are marked in blue on the map and include the large mansions which crowded the lower city, as you can see here and there. These buildings were recycled for new functions, mostly in the service of the army, but also to shelter colonizers' cultural and religious institutions, hence the Bibliothèque et Musée d'Alger and the bishop's headquarters. A closer reading of the plan reveals the demolished structures and the street pattern where the plaza was open. I hope you can see that underneath this, there are lines that show the streets that were demolished, the structures that were demolished. So we are enabled to begin to reconstruct the Ottoman center. Among the demolished buildings was Al Saida, another 17th century mosque in the foreground of the Palace of the Dey, which you see in the back. And I'm showing you a drawing by the army, by an army officer from the 1830s. Subsequent projects aim to regularize the Place d'Armes to express the glory of the colonial rule, each reflecting the ambition to give a French facade to the urban image. Meanwhile, the renovation project helped to record the center of Algiers rather accurately. Again, you see the fabric that was torn here. Let me show you just one more, and there are others. Most of these projects were not implemented, but they survive as documents to shed light onto layers of history. Such plans were complemented by sketches which gave life to the flatness of the plans. Read against the grain, the drawings in the French Army archives, Archives de la Génie housed at the Château de Vincennes, make it possible to reconstruct the center of Algiers. Here, I must acknowledge André Ramon's remarkable use of this visual collection in addition to other other textual resources. I think with the use of digital technologies, these days we would be able to give a lot more life to this reconstruction. An awareness of the Ottoman structure of Algiers dismantled the year 1830 as a break. Urban historians have argued that the French projects were concentrated in the lower city, thereby establishing a division between the European and the Arab cities, that is before the decision to create a new settlement immediately adjacent to the historic one. And I'm talking about parsements like those in the lower part of the city. Now, it is evident from the 1931 aerial view on the left that the parsements to the lower city violated the existing harmony between the dense spaces of Algiers with foreign and abrupt forms. Nevertheless, the social and physical practices of the Ottoman elites and the French occupiers do not seem to differ in their essence. Simply, one ruling power took over another. The duality that we commonly ascribe to the post-French Medina was based on a practice started 2 centuries ago. This duality in zoning is readable in the pre-1830s image of the city, the buildings on the lower level where the Ottoman elite lived and where the Ottoman monuments were concentrated. These are larger structures and identifiable and very identifiable than the closely knit and modest residential fabric of the upper city. The indigenous one, I think the plan expresses that well, but a European representation of the city from the sea also shows that on the lower level there is a concentration of more monumental buildings, larger buildings, and the hill is covered with the residential fabric of the rest. This is the end of my slides. The French occupation of Algeria has been told over and over from the French archives. But in a glaring absence, its coverage in the Prime Minister's archives has not attracted much scholarly attention. Despite the fact that in 2010, Prime Minister Archives Administration published a 2-volume collection of selected documents on Algeria in a transliterated format and made it easily accessible on its website. You need 1 click to reach these documents. What does the Ottoman historian's silence say about the place North Africa occupies in the empire's history? I think this is a very loaded question, and we may talk about this later on. The texts in the Prime Minister's archive deal primarily with the pre-French period, but there's a lot from after 1830. I began to browse through them to get a sense that Ottomans did not give up Algeria easily, and that Istanbul did not consider 1830 as a rupture. Let me highlight several sets of documents. The documents from the 1830s emphasize the resistance to the French, the fact that the occupation was costing France too much money, and that the situation called for intervention from Istanbul. The urgency of providing support for those known for their attachment to Ottomans is emphasized. For example, the resistance of Ahmed Bey, the last Bey of Constantine, is brought up in several documents. The defeat of French soldiers by Algerians are reported, as well as a letter from Sheriff Abdelkader to the Sultan, asking for help in their war against the French. Another set of documents from the 1830s and the 1840s focus on the refugees in Istanbul fleeing the occupation. It is underlined that they needed orientation for settling and for engaging in economic activities, especially because they did not know their way around. Yol yordan bilmediklerinden. The government designated a representative to facilitate their assimilation. The refugee question lingered, and there's a lot of data on waves of people arriving from Algeria as late as the 1890s. They were settled in Syria in cities varying from Beirut to Akka. I also came across a late order from 1894 that stipulates their acceptance to Ottoman citizenship. The Ottoman involvement in French occupation continued for decades as Algerians kept on sending petitions to Istanbul to end the cruelties they were subjected to. Zulüm was the word they used. Dating from the 1890s again, the complaints about religious pressure, termination of Islamic education, Christian nicknames given to Muslims, and forced conscriptions. Algerians looked to Istanbul for protection, but did Istanbul provide it? Could it provide it? The archive does not seem to answer this question. On the eve of World War I, one set of documents points to the strengthening of pan-Islamism in Algeria and the measures taken by France, but not only by France, also by Italy, Britain, and Russia. The Ottoman administration read this as allegiance to the empire. Now, it's going through the archive that I finally deciphered the bizarre name of one of the most important mosques in the lower part of the city, Kaçawa. What kind of a word is this, Kaçawa? Nobody seemed to know its etymology, but it turns out it is indeed a perfectly Turkish word, Keçiova, the plain of the goat. I have not yet figured out how this came to be the name of a mosque built in the 17th century, but at least part of the puzzle is resolved for now. After all, the French distortions to other languages are infamous. Muhammad becomes Mahomet, Beyazıt becomes Bejazet, and so forth. So Keçiören became, Keçiova became Kaçawa. And I mean, I'm sure you use this mosque's name over and over again without knowing what it was, and I didn't either. So there we go. Let me repeat that I barely scratched the surface, but enough to figure out there is tremendous amount of work to be done in the Ottoman archives in Istanbul. These documents are difficult to read and ideally called for teamwork. There are other Ottoman primary sources which open windows to the pre- and post-1830 decades. For example, Ali Rıza Pasha's Miratül Cezayir, The Mirror of Algeria, 1878, describes Algeria during the French occupation. The account complements the factual archival documents with more personal, social, and cultural observations. Returning to the time when he was a young man, Ali Rıza Pasha casts a critical gaze on the reactions and sentiments of the residents, the French army, the French policies vis-à-vis Islam, the opening of new roads and squares, the demolished buildings, the repurposing of mosques as churches and taverns, meyhanes. This is the first time I'm confronting this, but it's very interesting, and so forth. Now, to conclude my short presentation here, I will offer random fragments of Algerian presence in the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish Republic. The first is a folk song about the loss of Algeria and soldiers from Anatolia. The lyrics reminisce about the historic importance of Algiers as an imperial port, the black-eyed beauties residing in the city, lament the young Mehmets buried here, and stress its global importance saying that the whole world wants it. Cümle alem senin peşinde. According to researchers of folk culture, the song continues to be popular in Eastern Anatolia, serving as a remote memorial reference. During the second constitutional era, a European-style military march was composed using the tune, arguably by Sinan Efendi. It's titled The Algerian March, Cezayir Marşı, and has no lyrics. It's still played quite widely. I encountered a completely overlooked episode from the early 20th century in the Archives Diplomatiques in Nantes by chance. I stumbled upon this deserter from the French army in the Adana region in 1921 during Turkey's War of Independence. The deserters all had Arabic names, and they were all from Algeria. The short notes next to their names indicated that they had joined the Turkish forces. Several had actively engaged in anti-French propaganda and convinced other Algerians to shift sides. A military report explained the treacherous Kemalists who recruited Muslim soldiers from the French army, assuring them that they were brothers and integrated them into their own struggles. The stories of these men, I think, need to be told, establishing another link between Algeria, but again, this is not going to be easy research. One of the final chapters in the long history of Turks and the French occupation of Algeria took place during Algeria's decolonization war. If the official policy of the Turkish Republic opted for neutrality, based on the argument that the war was a civil one, the left-wing and Muslim intelligentsia stood in support of Algerians, as manifested amply in literature from the period. I'm going to stop here. I do not want to go into the current relationship with Algeria, and that would be opening a can of worms, but perhaps we can discuss them later. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I am happy to be here in Colombia for this panel. First of all, I'm very grateful for the invitation Zeynep sent me to share this moment with all of you. And I would like to thank Ararat for his efficiency and his availability in the preparation of my stay here. Thank you. I wanted to tell you these few words in English, but then I will have to speak in French because my English is not wonderful, as you can hear. And believe me, I prepared these sentences before coming here. I must admit, most of all, I must admit that speaking English terrifies me. So I need to thank my interpret to do the job. Thank you for understanding, and let's go. Okay. Parce que je suis historienne de l'Algérie à l'époque ottomane, je travaille naturellement dans ce qui est connu aujourd'hui comme le fonds ottoman algérien. Les originaux du fonds sont conservés à Alger et il en existe une copie microfilmée à Aix-en-Provence aux ANOM, au Centre national des archives d'outre-mer. Il s'agit là en fait du patrimoine principal patrimoine archivistique et la principale source des historiens de la période ottomane de l'Algérie. Il rassemble le principal de la documentation d'origine ottomane dont nous disposons.
Because I am a historian of Algeria during the Ottoman period, I naturally work in what is known today as the Ottoman Algerian collection. The originals of this collection are kept in Algiers, and a microfilmed copy exists in Aix-en-Provence at the Maison. This is the main archival heritage and the main source for historians of the Ottoman period in Algeria. It gathers the main documentation of Ottoman origins that we have.
Or, si le fonds n'est que très sommairement indexé, ce qui rend absolument complexe sa consultation, j'ai vite repéré qu'il n'est pas principalement composé des archives issues des activités judiciaires et administratives à l'époque ottomane, comme on aurait pu le supposer. C'est ce qui m'a mis sur la piste de l'histoire de ce fonds et de la façon dont il a été mis en forme et qui a transformé ma lecture des informations qui s'y trouvent, mais aussi la nature de la reconstitution de l'histoire à la fois ottomane et coloniale qu'elle informe.
However, the collection being similarly indexed, which makes its consultation quite complex, made me realize very quickly that this collection is not mainly composed of archives from judicial and administrative activities during the Ottoman period, as one might have supposed. This put me on the track of its history, and the history of the collection and the way that it was put together, which transformed my reading of the information therein, and also of the nature of the reconstruction of history, both Ottoman and colonial, that it informs.
Pour des raisons de temps, je vais proposer quelque chose de beaucoup plus court que ce que était mon propos initial. Je vais passer très vite sur les 3 premiers volets que j'avais considérés, qui correspondaient à différentes enquêtes que j'avais menées dans le fond et que je ne vais faire que résumer ici pour me concentrer sur le dernier volet, pour moi le plus nouveau et peut-être aussi le plus dépaysant et qui fondamentalement me pose question.
For reasons of time, I will propose something much shorter than was my initial purpose. I will pass very quickly over the first 3 parts that I had considered, which corresponded to different investigations carried out in the collection, and which I will now only summarize, to concentrate on the last, for me, the most novel, and which fundamentally raises questions.
Le fonds ottoman s'est avéré en fait être un fonds colonial, un fonds dont le choix du contenu et des classements des documents à partir de 1830 a été guidé par des impératifs coloniaux qui étaient liés à la propriété en particulier. Comment prendre place dans une ville, Alger, qui ne faisait pas de place aux conquérants, aux occupants. Cela explique le fait que les documents de ce fonds intéressent principalement la ville d'Alger et la propriété dans la ville. Et que le premier nom de ce fonds, en fait, a été les archives arabes du domaine colonial.
The Ottoman collection turned out, in fact, to be a colonial collection, a collection whose choice of content and classifications of documents from 1830 onwards was guided by colonial imperatives linked to property titles and ownership. How could it take its place in a city that did not make room for the occupants? This explains the fact that the documents in this collection are mainly concerned with the city of Algiers and property within the bounds of the city, and that the first name of this collection was the Arab Archives of the Colonial Domain.
En fait, c'est la première enquête sur laquelle je ne pourrais pas revenir ici, sur une institution centrale à l'époque ottomane, celle du voisinage, Hauma, et la question de sa disparition, en fait, dès le début de la conquête, qui m'a permis de prendre acte de cette dimension coloniale du fond. Je n'y reviens pas, mais c'est à travers cette enquête qui a été fondatrice pour moi que je l'ai découvert.
This discovery is the result of an initial investigation into a central institution of the Ottoman period, the Hamwan neighborhood, and its disappearance at the start of the conquest, which led me to delve into the colonial dimension of this collection.
Et cette découverte de cette colonisation a été un choc, évidemment, puisque la colonisation n'avait pas seulement transformé le futur post-colonial de l'Algérie, mais il avait aussi transformé le passé précolonial. Mais cette découverte m'a amené à situer historiquement la genèse de ce fonds, le début de la colonisation, et à le replacer dans les interactions accrochées et les rapports de force qui avaient rendu nécessaire le contenu et la forme qu'il a aujourd'hui.
This discovery was a shock. Colonization had not only transformed Algiers' post-colonial future, but also its pre-colonial past. This discovery allowed me to situate historically the genesis of the fund and the collection at the beginning of colonization, and to place it within the interlocking interactions and power relations that made necessary the content and form that it has today.
En fait, le nom du fonds ottoman est récent. Fonds ottoman est récent. Ottoman Collection est récent. Il date du rapatriement de ces archives en Algérie dans les années 1970, où le contenu du fonds a été réorganisé à ce moment-là, notamment avec la création d'une série nouvelle, la série judiciaire dans les fonds, documents des tribunaux, plus exactement, Wasa et El-Mahakim. Ce qui veut dire qu'il y a eu deux archivages.
Indeed, the name Ottoman Collection is very recent. It dates to the repatriation of these archives in Algeria in the 1970s, when the archives were themselves reorganized, and there was the creation of a new series, the judicial series. So what we effectively have is two different times of archiving.
Sur la question de ce double archivage, mon deuxième point, donc, je serai là aussi très rapide. Pour résumer, ce nouveau nom et ce nouveau reclassement ont en quelque sorte ottomanisé le fonds, avec la fonction de créer un patrimoine, c'est-à-dire aussi un passé précolonial à l'Algérie indépendante.
The question of this double archiving was my second point, and again, I will be very quick, but to summarize, this new name and this reclassification have in some ways Ottomanized the fund, the collection, with a function of creating a heritage, that is to say, a pre-colonial past in independent Algeria.
Or, par contraste, l'objectif de l'archivage un siècle plus tôt du même fonds par l'administration coloniale, puisqu'il a été effectivement établi, enfin archivé, disons, aux alentours de 1870, l'archivage de ce fonds avait eu de tout autres objectifs. Dans ce cas, en 1870, il n'a pas été question de créer un patrimoine et un passé, mais à l'inverse, il a été question d'enterrer l'un, ce patrimoine, et de faire table rase de l'autre, ce passé. C'était à la fois rassembler cette documentation avait été très utile pour l'administration coloniale et pour pouvoir effectivement faire un état de la propriété, et à la fois tous ces documents étaient autant de revendications de droits pour lesquels les habitants d'Alger, de droits pour les habitants d'Alger qu'il s'agissait d'éteindre. Donc en classant ces documents, on éteignait les droits liés à ces documents.
By contrast, the objective of archiving the same collection a century earlier by the colonial administration had been very different. In that case, it had not been a question of creating a heritage and a past, but rather of burying one and wiping the slate clean of the other. At the same time, gathering this documentation had both been very useful to the colonial administration, drawing up lots and rights, and in the same moment, these documents, by being classified, were a way of extinguishing the rights, the claims and the rights for the inhabitants of Algiers, which they comported.
Enfin, le troisième point à propos duquel je ne restituerai pas les enquêtes que j'ai faites ce troisième point concerne le fait que ce fonds, à mon sens, doit être lu comme un champ de bataille. Cela met en perspective la réalité de luttes qu'on a complètement oubliées et qui se sont jouées autour des droits de cité. Enfin, qui dirait qu'il y a eu des luttes à Alger dans les années 30-60.
Finally, the third point, about which I will not return, the investigation, which was third, concerns the fact that this collection must be read as a battlefield. This puts in perspective a reality of struggles that have been completely forgotten, battles that were played around the rights to the city.
J'ai notamment montré que des conflits naquirent des désordres impulsés par la conquête. Et que dans ce cadre, l'invocation par les autorités du droit local, incompatible avec l'esprit français, fut en fait un moyen de délégitimer des droits. Cette incompatibilité, cette pseudo-incompatibilité, en fait, je le montre, ne correspond pas à la réalité. En somme, En somme, cette archive n'est pas une documentation sage et routinière et il est nécessaire de lire le contenu de cette archive comme autant d'arguments, de revendications et d'armes fourbies contre l'adversaire.
Il va falloir que tu me donnes ta feuille parce que je n'ai pas du tout ça. Doing this, I hope to demonstrate that the conflicts which were born of the disorder impulsed by the conquest, within the frame of which the invocation to the authorities of local right were incompatible with the spirit, with the French spirit, all of which was a way of delegitimizing these rights. This incompatibility, as I show, does not correspond to the reality. In sum, this archive is not a wise and routine documentation. It is necessary to read its content as many arguments and claims that were heralded against the colonial adversary.
Dans mon quatrième point, sur lequel je vais m'étendre davantage, j'interroge en fait les conditions, mais aussi les limites de la colonisation après 1830 au travers du fonctionnement de l'importante institution ottomane du Beit el-Mal, sur laquelle j'ai beaucoup enquêté ces dernières années.
In my fourth point, I question the conditions and limits of colonization after 1830 through the functioning of the important Ottoman institution of Beit el-Mal, which I have intensively investigated in recent years.
L'activité de cette institution occupe les registres d'une série entière du fond, la série du Beit el-Mal, mais si la documentation de cette administration a été préservée, c'est que cette institution fut maintenue, ainsi que son personnel, plus d'une trentaine d'années après le début, la conquête d'Alger.
The activity of this institution occupies the registers of an entire series of the collection, the Beit el-Mal series. But if the documentation of this administration had been preserved, it is because this institution was maintained, as well as its personnel, for more than 30 years after the conquest of Algiers.
Même si très tôt, l'institution et son personnel furent placés sous le contrôle de l'administration du domaine colonial.
Even though both were very soon placed under the control of the administration of the colonial domain.
C'est d'ailleurs pourquoi la documentation qui compose la série du Beit el-Mal date en majorité de la période coloniale.
This is why most of the documentation of the Beit el-Mal series dates from the colonial period.
Au passage, ce maintien montre à l'œuvre une coproduction en langue arabe dans le domaine administratif qui a complètement été oubliée.
And to say it in passing, that this maintenance denotes an Arabic language co-production in the administrative field of the archive, which has been completely forgotten.
Un mot sur le Beit el-Mal. Hein. Le Beit el-Mal veut dire trésor. Mais à l'époque ottomane, cette administration correspond treasury, hein, okay? Mais à l'époque ottomane, cette administration correspond à une partie seulement du trésor, la gestion des biens sans maître.
So a word about the Beit el-Mal. The Beit el-Mal means a treasury, but in the Ottoman period, this administration corresponds to only one part of this treasury, which is the management of property without master.
Or, le travail mené dans ces archives m'a montré que l'activité du Beit el-Mal à l'époque ottomane se concentrait en fait sur la gestion et la protection des biens dont le ou la propriétaire qui était mort ou morte à Alger et les héritiers absents sur la gestion et la protection des biens dont le ou la propriétaire était mort à Alger et les héritiers dont les héritiers étaient absents, inconnus ou incertains.
However, the work carried out in these archives has shown me that the activity of Beit el-Mal during the Ottoman period was concentrated on the management and protection of property whose owner had died in Algiers and whose heirs were absent, unknown, or uncertain.
Ce n'est qu'en cas de vacances définitives avérées que les successions entraient au Beit el-Mal et que par suite, leur contenu était donc versé au trésor.
It was only in the event of a definite vacancy that the estates entered the Beit el-Mal and their contents paid to the treasury.
Les agents du Beit el-Mal assuraient la conservation et le maintien en l'état des biens, et l'institution présidait à la répartition des successions auprès des ayants droit se faisant connaître. Aussi, le gros des registres était-il des inventaires des biens des morts mis sous la tutelle du Beit el-Mal dans l'attente que ces biens soient transmis.
The agents of Beit el-Mal ensured the preservation and maintenance of the property and presided over the distribution of the inheritance to beneficiaries who made themselves known. Thus, the bulk of the registers were inventories of the property of the dead under the guardianship of Beit el-Mal, pending the transmission of this property.
Une telle tutelle sur les biens était également exercée sur les dépouilles, des biens qui sont aussi des biens, des personnes décédées sans héritier. C'est pourquoi le Beit el-Mal se chargeait de leur enterrement. L'institution, en somme, se substituait aux héritiers, elle réclamait les dettes dues aux morts, payait les créances, honorait leurs legs et assurait le partage des successions.
Such a guardianship of property was also exercised over the remains, also property, of those who died without an heir. This is why Beit el-Mal took care of their burial. The institution, in short, substituted itself to the heirs. It claimed the debts owed to the dead, paid their debts, honored their legacies, and ensured the division of their estates.
C'est aussi pourquoi le responsable du Beit el-Mal, qui était secondé par un cadi qui lui était attaché, un juge, tenait une audience au cours de laquelle étaient examinées et tranchées les prétentions sur telle ou telle succession.
This is why the head of Beit el-Mal, assisted by a qadi or a judge who was attached to him, held a hearing during which the claims on such and such estate were examined and decided.
D'une telle procédure, les registres ne consignent généralement que très furtivement les résultats, mais dans les premières années de la colonisation, un inventaire des objets qui devaient se trouver dans le local du Beit el-Mal a été établi en arabe à la demande des nouvelles autorités. Et cet inventaire révèle que parmi le mobilier du local, il y a la présence de 4 grands sacs de vieux actes.
The registers of such procedures generally recorded the results only very briefly. However, in the first years of colonization, an inventory of the objects found inside Beit el-Mal, drawn up in Arabic at the request of the new authorities, reveals among the furniture there the presence of 4 large bags of old deeds.
Le contenu de ces sacs n'a pas été préservé en tant que tel. En réalité, enfin, mon enquête me le fait dire, on en retrouve aujourd'hui des éléments conservés dans la série judiciaire telle qu'elle a été reconstituée par les archivistes algériens après la réception du fonds dans les années 1970.
The contents of these bags were not preserved as such. As my investigation leads me to declare, they are now found in a judicial series, which was constituted by the Algerian archivists after the collection was received in the 1970s.
En fait, ce qui a été totalement oublié et que rappelle finalement l'existence de ces sacs, c'est que l'organisation de la justice à Alger, avant la conquête, n'était pas construite sur le principe d'une institution judiciaire unifiée et autonome. Le Beit el-Mal abritait un tribunal, donc, disposant de ses archives, conservées dans des sacs.
What has been completely forgotten, and that these bags remind us of, is that the organization of justice in Algiers before the conquest was not built on the principle of a unified and autonomous judicial institution. The Beit el-Mal housed a court, therefore, with its own archives kept in balance.
Cela montre qu'il ne faut pas penser par secteur, distinguant administration d'un côté et justice de l'autre, mais il faut penser par juridiction. Les pouvoirs s'exercer par la justice. Or, dans l'organisation du fonds, cette absence de distinction a été rendue complètement invisible par la création d'une série Beit el-Mal privilégiant les registres exclusivement. On a là un effet concret des distorsions que les classements du fonds ont pu provoquer.
This shows that one should not think in sectors distinguishing between, on the one hand, an administration and a justice on the other, but rather think of the occurrence as a jurisdiction, powers being exercised by justice. In the reorganization of this collection, the absence of this distinction has been made completely invisible by the creation of a Beit el-Mal series, which privileges only the registers kept. Here we have, here we have the effect of a concrete distortion that this new classification has provoked.
Lire la colonisation du Beit el-Mal dans le fonds ottoman est assez aisé. Les réformes administratives de 1849, puis la loi de 1851 ont mis officiellement un terme à l'autonomie des agents de l'administration du Beit el-Mal.
Reading the colonization of Beit el-Mal in the Ottoman collection is quite easy. The administrative reforms of 1849 and then the law of 1851 officially put an end to the autonomy of the agents of the institution of Beit el-Mal.
Mais les effets de la colonisation sont bien plus anciens, que ces lois.
The effects of colonization are much more ancient than these laws themselves.
À compter des années 1840, certains des registres furent dévolus spécifiquement à la comptabilité mensuelle des caisses de l'institution.
From 1840 onwards, some of the registers were devoted specifically to the monthly accounting of the institution's fund.
Les tableaux comptables constituèrent la matière principale, sinon exclusive, des registres les plus tardifs jusqu'en 1860.
The accounting tables constituted the main, if not the exclusive, material of these late registers until after 1860.
Autre exemple, sous l'impulsion des nouvelles autorités, le Beit el-Mal se vit dédier la tâche d'entamer une première version de l'état civil à travers l'enregistrement de tous les morts de la ville. Dès 1836, apparurent des enregistrements non plus des biens, mais des morts qui étaient identifiés par leur nom, adresse, âge, bref, un état civil.
Another example is that under the impulse of the new authorities, the Beit el-Mal was given the task of starting a first version of a civil status through the registration of all the dead in the city. From 1836 onward, the registration of the dead identified by name, address, age, name of heirs, and name of person who declared the death was no longer a matter of property, but a civil register.
Ces dispositions administratives d'enregistrement ont masqué ce qui constituait le bien fondé et, disons, la dimension politique du Beit el-Mal. C'est-à-dire assurer la tutelle des biens, c'était identifier les morts en des termes politiques, disons, plutôt que administratifs.
These administrative registration arrangements obscured the very essence of Beit el-Mal, namely to ensure the guardianship of property was to identify the dead in political rather than administrative terms.
Yes, thank you. En fait, identifier les biens des morts et leur succession, c'était identifier les lignées à travers lesquelles la transmission des droits sur ces biens se trouvait assurée.
To identify the property of the dead and their succession was to identify the lineages through which the transmission of the rights to this property was assured.
Cela dit, en fait, le fonds ottoman permet de mettre en lumière la continuation d'une activité juridictionnelle du Beit el-Mal dans les années 1850 et suivantes. Enfin, à partir des années 1850, dans les années 1850. Sorry.
That said, in fact, the Ottoman collection does allow us to highlight the continuation of the jurisdictional activity of Beit el-Mal from the 1850s onward.
Cela n'apparaît pas dans les textes législatifs coloniaux. Au contraire, tout signe la fin des prérogatives de cette institution. J'ai évoqué la loi du 16 juin 1851 qui dépouille le Beit el-Mal de toute personnalité juridique spécifique, qui n'en fait plus qu'une caisse, un dépôt, une caisse.
This does not at all appear in the colonial legislative texts. On the contrary, everything in them indicates the end of the prerogative of this institution. I mentioned the law of the 16th of June 1851, which stripped the Beit el-Mal of any specific personality, making it nothing more than a safe.
Une autre preuve de la disparition des prérogatives du Beit el-Mal est l'absence dans un dictionnaire de législation algérienne, celui de Ménerville en 1866, de toute entrée spécifique à ce terme, qui n'apparaît pas non plus dans la grosse section domaine de ce dictionnaire. Institutionnellement, le Beit el-Mal paraît ne plus exister.
Another proof of this disappearance, of the prerogative of the Beit el-Mal, is its absence in the dictionary of Algerian legislation, the Ménerville dictionary, which lacks any specific entry for this term, not appearing under the lower section of domain either. For all intents and purposes, it seems to no longer exist.
Mais dans les archives du Front ottoman, tout donne l'impression que le Beit el-Mal continue son activité selon des modalités identiques à celles qui prévalaient à l'époque ottomane. Mieux, la création d'une maison de pauvres entre 1848 et 1850 à peu près, Dar el-Fuqara. Donc c'est un asile qui est dédié aux musulmans dans le cadre de la politique caritative coloniale. Cette maison des pauvres apparaît dans ces archives comme une annexe du Beit el-Mal.
But in the archives of the Ottoman collection, everything gives the impression that the Beit el-Mal continues its activity according to the same modalities that prevailed in the Ottoman period. Even better, the creation of a house for the poor between 1848 and 1850,
Dar el-Fuqara,
an asylum dedicated to Muslims within the framework of the colonial charity policy, appears in these archives as an annex of the Beit el-Mal.
Ces agents tiennent un registre à partir de 1852 des entrées dans cette maison qui fondent les prérogatives du Beit el-Mal à assurer la mise en ordre des successions de ceux qui y entrent et y meurent.
Its agent kept a register from 1852 onwards of entries into the house, which was the basis for the prerogative of Beit el-Mal to ensure the orderly succession of those who entered and died there.
Ce rôle d'annexe s'avère être le même que jouaient à l'époque ottomane d'autres asiles qui ont été détruits ou occupés au moment de la conquête.
This role of an annex turns out to be the same one played in the Ottoman period by other asylums destroyed or occupied at the time of conquest.
L'analyse que j'ai faite de ce registre m'a montré que les résidents étaient moins des sans le sou, enfin, n'étaient pas des gens qui n'avaient pas d'argent, que des personnes parfois très riches, que leur entrée dans cet asile placée sous la tutelle du Beit el-Mal, tutelle qui en faisait des pauvres du Beit el-Mal, c'est-à-dire ces assistés dans la gestion de leur succession.
My analysis into this register revealed that the residents of this house were less penniless people than sometimes very rich ones whose entry into the asylum put them under the guardianship of the Beit el-Mal, a guardianship that made them the poor of the Beit el-Mal, which is to say, those assisted in the management of their estates.
C'était essentiellement des gens sans famille dans la ville, mais pas seulement.
It was essentially people without family connection in the city, but not solely.
L'entrée à la maison des pauvres s'accompagnait de déclarations des entrants, identifiant leurs héritiers, leurs créanciers, leurs débiteurs et les lieux où se trouvaient les biens. Cet enregistrement autorisait les agents du Beit el-Mal à récupérer les biens des défunts, là où ils se trouvaient, et à procéder au partage de ces biens entre les potentiels héritiers.
Entry to the house was accompanied by declarations identifying the heirs, creditors, and debtors, and the places where each individual's goods were located. This registration authorized the agents of Beit el-Mal to recover the property of the deceased, where it was located, and to proceed with the division of the property among potential heirs.
Cette tutelle sur les successions était loin d'être informelle. Dans un procès de 1856, opposant une prétendante à l'héritage d'une autre femme que lui dénigre le Beit el-Mal, en mettant en cause ses liens avec sa morte, enfin, avec la morte, l'administrateur du Beit el-Mal est présenté comme étant administrateur du droit des pauvres, en arabe, Nadir Haq al-Fuqara, je épargne.
This guardianship of estates was far from being informal. In a lawsuit of 1856 against a claimant to the inheritance of another woman, to whom the Beit al-Mal denigrated by questioning her relationship with the dead woman, the administrator of the Beit al-Mal is presented as being the administrator of the rights of the poor.
En somme, les agents du Beit al-Mal continuaient d'assurer les prérogatives administratives et juridiques telles qu'elles l'étaient à l'époque ottomane. Ils agissaient en administrateurs des biens des morts placés sous la tutelle de l'institution. Les déclarations laissées par les morts à leur entrée à Dar al-Fuqara, données à la maison des pauvres, donnaient quitus à ces agents pour intervenir afin de récupérer les biens des morts, là où ils avaient dit, avant de mourir bien sûr, les avoir laissés.
In sum, the agents of Beit al-Mal continued to carry out the administrative and legal prerogatives as they were in the Ottoman era. They acted as administrators of the property of the dead placed under the guardianship of the institution. The declarations left by the dead on their entry into Dar al-Fuqara gave these agents the right to intervene in order to recover the property of the dead where they had said before dying that they had left it.
Comme à l'époque ottomane, le Beit al-Mal enterrait les pauvres, c'est-à-dire ceux ceux-là même qui avaient confié leur dépouille à cette institution en entrant à Dar al-Fuqara. Comme à l'époque ottomane, un lien étroit existait entre le Beit al-Mal et les hôpitaux, dont on a globalement ignoré la fonction cruciale de préservation des successions.
As in the Ottoman era, the Beit al-Mal buried the poor, those who had entrusted their remains to the institution by entering the house of the poor. As in the Ottoman period, there was a close link between the Beit al-Mal and hospitals, whose function of preserving estates has been largely forgotten.
Ces éléments révèlent la nature du pouvoir du Beit al-Mal.
These elements reveal the nature of Beit al-Mal's power.
La fonction du Beit al-Mal est de multiples manières reconnue et n'a rien d'informel. Son pouvoir découle, au-delà de la mise en coffre, de la responsabilité inhérente à cette prise en charge.
The function of Beit al-Mal is in many ways recognized and has nothing informal about it. Its power derives not only from its being a safe, but from the political charge inherent to this responsibility.
Ce pouvoir se fonde sur l'importance de la transmission, dans la capacité des choses transmises à fonder des lignées et des droits associés à l'appartenance à une lignée, et dans la capacité du Beit al-Mal à s'insérer ainsi dans les lignées.
This power is based on the importance of transmission, in the capacity of things transmitted to found lineages and rights associated with belonging to a lineage, and in the capacity of Beit al-Mal to insert itself into said lineage.
Un rôle politique essentiel.
An essential political role.
Okay. Que l'organigramme colonial et plus largement les sources en français rendent invisible cette activité interpelle les historiens et met en question la capacité de ces sources à restituer la complexité de la réalité.
The fact that the colonial organization chart renders this activity invisible is a matter of concern to historians and sheds a question on its sole capacity to restitute the complexity of reality.
En tout cas, cette invisibilisation ne permet pas de justifier d'une histoire qui en ferait l'impasse.
This invisibilization does not allow to justify a history that is not included.
En réalité, le pouvoir à l'époque coloniale recouvre une sphère plurielle et concurrentielle qui résulte aussi des usages qu'en font les usagers. Les gens. Sorry.
The reality of the time is one of a power that covers a plural and competitive sphere, resulting largely from people's use of it.
Et ces manifestations saisissables, y compris entre eux, sont autant de moments d'expression de cette pluralité et de ces concurrences. La tâche de l'historien pourrait consister à détecter la variété de ces pouvoirs, de leur mobilisation et de leurs affrontements, sans s'en tenir aux organigrammes coloniaux. Ce serait en somme une façon de remettre le colonial à sa place. Merci beaucoup.
Its manifestations, or the observation of its emissions, are so many moments of expression of this plurality and competition. The task of history could consist in detecting the variety of these powers, their mobilizations, and their confrontations, without limiting itself to the colonial organization charts. This would, in short, be another way of putting the colonial in its place. Thank you.
Thank you. We have until 3:30, right? So I will be extremely brief in my comments and then open the floor for questions. First of all, let me thank the entire organization, the Maison Française, right, and the main sponsors, the Algiers Center, but also the Emmanuelle Center. For the humanities, but also the departments of history, Lisa, the Middle East Institute, and the French department. All these departments and centers have contributed. And also, all we thank Isabelle, who is known as the Superman of all conferences. Incredible job. So this event today, just to maybe kind of take a larger view, this event comes at the end of the week of reflection on Algeria at 60, right? So the birth date of Algeria is 1962, right? So now it's 60. And as a nation, as an independent nation, I suppose this place behind it. And obviously, this date immediately echoes 1830, right? As a date that has been central in the historiography of colonialism as the matrix for at least for the Europeans, especially for the French, the matrix of a certain form of colonial domination. With the idea that a new form of empire, modern empire, starts in 1830 after the ruins of the first monarch, like Ancien Régime empire, finished its slow death around 1850. So I think what the conference is trying to, the afternoon is trying to do is to make sense of that date, 1830, as this beginning of a new empire. By saying that actually it makes sense only as a rupture, it makes sense only in the context of the French colonial historiography, right? And actually, if you pay attention to the historiography of French imperialism in the past few years, even that within the French system, the French historiography is being questioned, and people do insist on hesitations, on reflections, right? When well-known example is the apparition in French of the word decolonization in 1836 to speak about the French leaving Algeria as early as 1836. So at the moment of hesitation, even in that context, but even if you don't go there, right, there is really this date makes sense primarily within a French, within an interest in French historiography and French colonialism. So the goal of the conference was to obviously displace the state. And anecdotically, it's actually interesting. I think we never really set up on the day because this conference sometimes was called between us as Algiers beyond 1800 and sometimes Algiers beyond 1830. Those two dates have floated around, and actually even the official communication, I think sometimes we use 1800 and sometimes 1830, which I think is a sign of this the importance for us of moving the dates in order, as Zeynep was saying, as displacing the periodization. So one of my questions here is, what is at stake in this discussion? Who's concerned? Who's historiography is so obviously, if we stop thinking about 1830 as a central date, we are not subsuming the entire history of Algeria with French history. And that's a big plus, some progress, right?
I suppose also there is something very important at stake in taking 1830 as a central date of the history of Algeria, which is to think about obviously the Ottoman Empire and the idea that in the 19th century it is not still alive and kicking, and there's still very strong presence of the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, which is what a very now old historiography as we had denied for such a long time, right? So this space in 1830 as a central date for the history of Algeria is also a way of rethinking empires in the 19th century, the Mediterranean region. My question here is, what is at stake from an Algerian point of view? What is at stake for the Algerian space in 1830? And I'm saying this because, as you may know, there was a debate in France about a year ago when Emmanuel Macron announced that, it was actually in October 2021, Emmanuel Macron declared that there were colonizations in Algeria before the French, right? He said, I'm translating from the French here, so well, I am fascinated by the fact that, by the capacity that Turkey has to make have people forget the role it played in Algeria and the domination it has exercised. So Macron's speech was about the idea of a displacement, right, of like the Ottoman Empire being displaced. Colonization, Turkish colonization, Turkish colonization displayed by the French. And so obviously, there are tons of issues with that. It's a colonial trope, or from Tocqueville on, it's a trope in the discourse about Algeria. But there are tons of reasons that I won't get into details, but there are tons of reasons why it doesn't work. First of all, there was no conquest of Algiers by Turks. There was no colonization per se. There was as Nordin Amaha has shown very well, throughout the 19th century, there was called by Algerians, right, through petitions to the Ottoman Empire as a form of protector, right? So there are lots of reasons why this idea of colonization being displayed by the world. And so in Zeynep paper, the fascinating paper that she gave, she actually evoked a symmetric erasure of Algeria in the Ottoman, the historically the Ottoman Empire. I'd like to hear more about this. And fascinating. I mean, the paper was fascinating to me as a way of showing that how including Algeria in the history of the Ottoman Empire transforms our understanding of the Ottoman Empire. But I have a question about Algiers itself. When you were in your presentation, you showed how you insisted on the erasure of the Ottoman center by the French colonizers, and to the French city, right, beside the Arab cities. This is the result of the 19th century. And so I was wondering about this difference between the Ottoman and the Arab cities. Does it exist in 1830? Is it clear in the map of the city? Is it clear in the urbanism? Or is it something that appears actually from the destruction of the Ottoman city by the French? Is this an artifact in a way? Is the distinction an artifact of colonization itself? So that was my question for you. And then to Isabelle, my question, your very rich paper. Isabelle is one of my favorite historians, and I have an incredible, great admiration for all the work she did. She's I told her again today, I hope she this compliment. She's a slow historian. Like, we have a lot of fast historians, but she's a slow one. She goes again and again in the same place and digs deeper, and that's fascinating. One of the questions I had in terms of thinking about the remettre l'histoire coloniale à sa place, right? She shows the multiplicity of the forms of power that were at work in the early years of French colonization, or after 1830, the 40s and 50s, and how those different forms of power sometimes
being exploited by the French colonial state, sometimes discarded, sometimes appropriated, right? And so, and so in this multiplicity of forms of power, you showed, you told us about the importance of lineages and transmission, right? So lineages of families. And so I was wondering about how in your work as a historian, if you, how do you show in families, in transmissions of property, but also transmissions of things and property, beyond material possessions, so like cultural goods. How do you think about this transmission of, let's say, in the elites, obviously, right? The urban elites, transmission of the sorry, the translation is the transmission of, let's say, an Ottoman heritage. Something that goes beyond the institutions, right? That goes beyond the forms of property, that goes beyond, right? How does that work in families? Do you have a way of getting at this? You know what I mean? Like, or is it just, can you just do a history of those institutions? What does it mean to be an Ottoman Algiers after 1830, right? In terms of your own sense of allegiance, personal, you know, when you're not in exile. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, let me try to answer this question, which is not easy because it's very difficult to peel the layers of that city. I do not know exactly who lived where in the upper city, in the Medina, and it's a very mixed population. But I tried to show, I think I'm beginning to understand that there was a differentiation between the lower city and the upper city. First of all, it's very clearly divided by a street. The form of the city explains quite a lot. And then when we read the French plans à l'inverse to the other, against the grain, we do see where the upper mixed families, I mean, Ottoman is an Ottoman family in Algeria, it's a mixed family, right? But these were the people who held the power and who were as close to Istanbul as possible at that time. So they all lived in that lower part of the city. And I looked at where the monuments were built, where the major mosques are. Perhaps it's pure logic, but they're all in that lower part of the city, close to the large mansions, which are next to each other. So certainly by peeling the French plans, I was able to see a power structure engraved in the city. But of course, we misread it. And I'm to be blamed for that too. I misread it because I said, oh, the French came and did all this personnel, and then there's a differentiation. Yes, the shape is different with the French, but I think power-wise, there was a layering there. The French came and sat where the Ottomans were. And what are the Ottomans again? The Kulolus, the mixed families, but those were the ones who left, which enabled the French to take over that lower city and do whatever they wanted to do with it. And I mentioned Ali Reza Pasha and his memoir. I just discovered this. It is so fascinating because he was very much interested in urbanism. He became the governor of Tripoli, and he used what he learned from the French in Algiers in terms of cutting streets in Tripoli. So, I mean, things are complicated, they go back and forth, but what was the Ottoman city? Why were those markets Ottoman, as everybody calls them? So a lot more work needs to be done, clearly.
Ok. Merci beaucoup pour tes questions, Emmanuelle. Ah, pardon. Alors, je ne sais pas très bien comment dans quel sens les prendre. Mais enfin, je relève plusieurs choses. D'une part, pour moi, en tout cas, il n'y a pas de différence entre arabe et ottoman. C'est-à-dire que ça, c'est un truc, c'est clair. Enfin, je veux dire, ottoman, c'est un moment. Voilà. Et d'ailleurs, je défends l'idée que l'Empire ottoman est d'abord et avant tout une ressource ponctuellement sollicitée dans des situations spécifiques, etc. Et c'est pour ça que l'Empire n'est pas un truc qui part d'Istanbul et vaguement atterrit de temps en temps sur les rives d'Alger, et ne parlons pas de l'intérieur. Non, pas du tout. L'Empire ottoman, c'est une ressource dont s'emparent les personnes régulièrement à travers justement des institutions et des pratiques, disons. Et oh, sorry. Oh. Thank you.
So thank you very much for your question. Your questions, I don't exactly know where to start taking them in, but a few things arise from the start. First, I don't see and make a distinction between Arab and Ottoman, other than sort of heralding a temporal situation. And this is related to the fact that we must understand that the empire is not in this kind of top-down structure that eventually comes and picks on the shores of Algiers, but rather it is a resource that is functionally solicited when needed by individuals by appealing, as the paper has shown, to specific institutions.
Ensuite, tu m'interroges sur ces différents types de pouvoirs et notamment, en fait, quel est le pouvoir du Beit el-Mal, en fait? C'est-à-dire que, effectivement, le Beit el-Mal a pour fonction de prendre en charge les héritages, les successions. Parce que les successions, ce ne sont pas des biens, ce sont d'abord des droits. Et ces droits, c'est en particulier le fait de désigner une lignée dans laquelle on s'inscrit. C'est-à-dire que le travail du Beit el-Mal, sa dimension politique, elle tient à sa capacité de préserver des affiliations et des appartenances. Et ces appartenances, elles sont politiques parce qu'elles sont fondées sur des droits partagés. Sorry.
So, and to the question about the types of power, which then becomes the question about the type of power of the Beit el-Mal, we can answer it by looking at its function, which is to take charge of estates. As we've discussed, that these estates and this succession is not so much goods as rights, and it is these rights and the passing on of these rights and these entanglements that create lineages. And so there is an inherent political power in the fact of being the agent of preservation of belongings and entitlement lines.
Je continue parce que du coup, effectivement, le Beit el-Mal, la tâche que accomplit le Beit el-Mal, en réalité, c'est une tâche qu'on va retrouver dans d'autres formes de pouvoir. En ce moment, je me questionne sur le fait que les consulats ont exactement aujourd'hui, la même fonction d'affiliation qui se joue d'abord sur ces biens. Donc, en fait, sur la question de la responsabilité des biens. J'ai fait l'expérience... je m'arrête. J'ai fait l'expérience à Tunis, en arrivant à Tunis sans carte d'identité, en voulant laisser ma voiture, du fait qu'on m'en a empêché. Parce que si je partais alors que je n'étais pas affiliée au consulat, mon bien était sous la responsabilité de personne. Et c'était un gros problème. À partir du moment où j'ai été au consulat, j'étais affiliée au consulat, il y avait un responsable de ma voiture. En fait, c'est assez... c'est bête, mais je veux dire, là, le Beit el-Mal fait exactement le même travail, en fait. C'est ça que je veux dire. Comme c'est des choses, pardon, juste, comme ce sont des choses, ça est considéré comme de moindre valeur. Enfin, on a cette idée-là, qu'on n'est plus dans l'idée des choses. Voilà. J'ai encore un petit mot après.
Yeah. So the interesting thing when we think about what this task of the Beit el-Mal is and trying to transpose to what kinds of what types of power serve the same function today, we see that the consulates in many ways have the same kinds of responsibility. An example, an anecdotal experience was being in Tunisia myself without an ID, wanting to leave my car, and that being a problem because I was not registered to the consulate. And so had I left the car without this affiliation having been established administratively, the car would have been left without a guardian. And so these things that seem to be of lesser value have some kind of equivalence between the Beit al-Mal's function and the consulate functions today.
Merci. Et du coup, effectivement, par exemple, utiliser les archives, enfin, utiliser le Beit al-Mal pour définir un état civil, c'est-à-dire enregistrer tout le monde, c'est pas du tout le même travail que le Beit al-Mal faisait, qui était d'enregistrer les choses, c'est-à-dire il enregistrait les droits, et donc il donnait une définition politique à son activité, là où on a une définition administrative, administrative au sens où il s'agit de connaître les gens. Bon, voilà, donc là-dessus, il y a toute une littérature. Et le deuxième point sur lequel je veux insister, c'est que tu disais, et alors, qu'est-ce que ça devient? Et il me semble que ça devient, ces pouvoirs, en fait, ils persistent, je ne sais pas sous quelle forme, mais là me vient tout de suite à l'esprit la Roma, enfin, l'institution de la Roma dont j'ai parlé, dit deux mots tout à l'heure, hein, donc du voisinage, dont j'ai dit qu'elle avait disparu, et de fait, elle disparaît dans les archives, mais en réalité, elle est hyper vivante aujourd'hui. Je veux dire, la Roma, c'est quelque chose que tout le monde connaît. Enfin, et donc, je parlerai plutôt de forme de délégitimation. C'est-à-dire que c'est des pouvoirs, encore, ce sont des potentiels pouvoirs, parce que je peux vous dire que la Roma, elle exerce un pouvoir. Enfin, je veux dire, il faut habiter là-bas pour savoir que tu es pris dans des rapports. Enfin, bon, qu'est-ce qu'on entend par pouvoir? Mais je veux dire, on vous fabrique. Enfin, ce sont des institutions qui fabriquent les gens, enfin, qui vous situent, qui vous positionnent, qui vous donnent des pouvoirs et des devoirs. Enfin, des droits et des devoirs, par exemple. Donc, j'appelle ça pouvoir. Alors, c'est un petit peu subversif. Je veux bien l'entendre que c'est un peu subversif, oui. Mais du coup, ça permet de réfléchir plus largement à qu'est-ce qu'une histoire populaire, en fait, permet d'approfondir, en fait, des réalités dans lesquelles qu'on étudie.
So using, to the question of the ways in which the colonial powers seize the existing powers in place, we can see, for example, that the use of the Beit al-Mal to draw up civil registers is a kind of distortion of its original application of power, whereas had been taken charge of things which in their thingness create a kind of political relationship of rights between people. Suddenly we're an administrative relationship where the information being taken is sort of a population census. On this, there's a very large literature. To the question of the ways in which these powers persist, the first thing to come to mind is the Huma, which is an institution which I talked about in the first section as the neighborhood, which has disappeared in the archives, but which is still very much alive in experience. And so it's less about a disappearance than a delegitimation of these powers that are very potent and that are structuring of individuals insofar as they situate individuals within an entire network of rights and duties. So perhaps it's a slightly subversive use of the term power here, but it seems to me important to broaden the question of popular history of studying a popular history and deepening these questions.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes for discussion. I'm sorry I spent too much time, but we have 10 minutes for 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
We have way more time at the end of the second panel.
Yes,
We'll have a kind of a round, an open discussion after the end of the second panel, where we can go back to the first panel, right, and ask questions. But we have some time now for questions. Yes, sir.
Two things come to my mind. There is the history in this presence in Algeria Mediterranean is characterized by succession of peoples coming from Venezuela, settling. So when we now look at it in terms of the nation state emerging at that same time, the France played a very prominent role. So that's one angle that I think needs to be looked at. And the other one is to compare what's happening with the French expansion in Africa, with their attempt to take over the use of Hispanic American invention of so-called Latin America. There is a lot of comparability there in terms of the invention history following the nation state. So the question, but it's a combination of issues that I think are playing here as well.
Thank you for your comments. I am afraid it surpasses me to answer them in a meaningful way. They're a bit too broad for me, and I think I find it a little bit problematic to jump from one thing to one geography to another, from one region to another even, because I'm not that kind of historian. I work with a specific region and try to understand that. And honestly, it does surpass me to make broad, to reach the broader lesson. Well, again, maybe Isabelle can handle this. I can't.
Si j'ai bien compris, je sais pas. Je vais dire que le dénominateur commun entre la question de la méditerranéité. C'est vrai que pour moi, c'est un peu haut, c'est un peu abstrait. Enfin, voilà, c'est un peu abstrait. Et du coup, je comprends pas bien désolée, sorry, I don't understand your question because it's very abstract. Question. So.
For me, it's an interesting way of thinking about this because it's the difference between the local kind of social history of those issues and taking a imperial long duration historical perspective. And so here I do see the clash between those two different approaches, and the misunderstanding maybe comes from the question of scale.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and some historians do that very well. I think we're not those.
C'est quoi? Certains historiens savent très bien opérer à cette échelle, c'est pas votre cas.
One more question? Yes. So, Toby?
He can't hear you.
I wonder if you could get a little bit more granular in. I was really struck by the statement. I don't make a difference between Arab and it seems as though that distinction is present in speaking about who lives where.
Puisqu'il semblerait que cette distinction existe dans la question de l'identité sociale,
implies, and actually there's a question in the beginning as well, since you were speaking about who lives in which.
Oui, enfin, je répondais sur la question de l'architecture, enfin, ou des formes, aussi des temporalités. C'est quoi le temps arabe et c'est quoi le temps ottoman? Donc voilà, je répondais sur cette question-là. Mais oui, je veux bien ou alors je continue. Mais en tout cas, moi, ce que je sais, c'est que à l'époque sur laquelle je travaille, arabe ou turc. Ce sont des catégories juridiques qui renvoient à toute autre chose que des catégories ethniques. Donc, déjà, l'emploi de ces termes est compliqué. C'est-à-dire qu'en fait, ça renvoie à des droits, à des privilèges, à des statuts. Et c'est pas comme on n'a pas affaire à un damné avec des colonnes, on n'a pas une société toute rangée de cette façon-là. Ce sont des termes plus politiques en réalité que des termes d'origine. Voilà.
This specific statement was said in the context of trying to distinguish between temporalities, what would be an Arab time and an Ottoman time. But what I can say to the question of that distinction was that it was a legal rather than an ethnic distinction, which comported a whole set of rights and privileges. And so being a status question, even being a status question, it did not organize into a neatly sort of sealed categorization of society, but which is inherently much more political than that.
I find the question very interesting, but also almost impossible to give a clear answer to. I try to imagine what happened in those markets. I try to imagine how many languages were spoken, how distorted those languages were, how much Spanish there was in the language that the Arabic language, how many Turkish words had been integrated into that language. What did the Jewish population do? We also know that there was an Italian community, but where were they from? What kind of Italian they spoke? It's very difficult to document them, but it is fascinating to imagine what was going on there. Imagine the shopping in those stores. And I find it fascinating, and it triggers it makes the place real to me. But if you ask me, further details about the ethnic groups, not a chance, I wouldn't know. And I haven't read anything that could clarify those issues for me.
Okay, if there aren't any other questions for the time being, we're going to take a break, and you can keep some of your questions for later when we have maybe at the end we have an hour global discussion. Thank you so much.